Hello, my lovely drama friends. Welcome back to the Drama House, the home of nostalgia, chaos, and games that raised us better than our parents ever did. I'll be your host for this deep dive. My name is Lady Drama, and if this is your first time at the Drama House, welcome home, baby. Today we're talking about The Sims, the game that turned a generation of us into interior designers, chaos gremlins, and low-key god figures. But what if I told you that this cozy little dollhouse almost never made it out of the attic? Behind the suburban charm and green plum bulbs is a development story full of doubt, drama, and one or two execs who really didn't believe anyone would want to simulate taking a shower or making a meal. It was messy, it was risky, and for a while, even some folks at Maxis thought Will Wright's vision was just too weird for mainstream gaming. But what started as a nearly abandoned experiment ended up capturing the spirit of the entire decade it was built in. From early 90s tech quirks to turn of the millennium optimism. It wasn't just a game, it was a digital mirror, a creative playground, and maybe, without meaning to, a quiet revolution in who games were for. Get your dial-up modem ready, Queen, because we'll have to go back 20 years in time. Oh, no, wait, how many years? Ooh, damn. Friends, it seems the time travel will be longer than I expected. It's 34 years, actually. Because I want to start the story from the very beginning, and I'll take you back with me to 1991.
TV show Peanuts, you'd hear the adults talking, and the adults would always be like, "Wah, wah, 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 wah," or soft or loud. You could tell if they were mad or angry or what, but you wouldn't hear what they were saying. You'd have to read that into it.
World inside the computer that's so lifelike that after a few minutes the user stops thinking of this as a computer game. They start thinking of it as a little microcosm inside their computer.
That kind of expands your perceptions outside of reality, and that you can go back and apply to reality.
Being a smoker myself, I developed a sixth sense that makes me spot a fellow cigarette buddy when I see one, and I'm not gonna lie, I have always had a feeling Will Wright is one. I know, you must be thinking, how the hell is this an irrelevant? And honestly, it's not. I just wanted to put it out there, because this first chapter of the video is all about Will. I mentioned how our story would begin in the early 90s, but just to set the stage right, let's establish where Will was at that time in his professional life. Because in 1991, Will Wright was already pretty successful as a game designer. In the mid-80s, he sold a game called Raid on Bungling Bay to Broderbund or Broderboot, one of the earliest PC gaming software companies. That first game was a shoot-'em-up in which the player flies the helicopter over various cities and islands, trying to bomb buildings and blow up bridges. However, when designing Raid on Bungling Bay, Wright noticed that he was more interested in creating the buildings on the islands rather than blowing them up. He started thinking of a game in which the point would be to design buildings or maybe to build a city. And so Will turned his head to literature. Yes, honey, we love a king who knows how to read. Will became a fan of the writings of J. Wright Forrester, an MIT professor, which argued that urban planning could be carried out more rationally by a computer simulation than by humans, because the computer wouldn't be blinded by intuitive biases, even suggesting a proposal for a computer simulation that could manage the entire planet. These concepts tickled Will's brain, combined with the work of a mathematician named John Horton Conway, who back in the 70s came up with a biological simulation called the Game of Life. The game, which simulated the growth and death of a living creature, was based on the principle of cellular automata, in which the programmer assigns simple rules to discrete units or cells. Conway's purpose was to show how a simple structure of cells could be organized to simulate complex, lifelike systems in which unpredictable or emergent outcomes occur. And I mean, at this point, Will must have been in a state of obsession with this concept because, honey, that's some serious researching and learning, to be honest. Like, babe, I get tired reading recipes for cakes. J. Wright Forrester books have between 200 and 300 pages. I bet Will was spending many sleepless nights trying to get to the core of the matter, which was a simulation of a life. So he decided to apply the theories he had been learning about to imitate the dynamics of a city. The player would be responsible for adjusting around 100 variables in a way that allows the city to thrive. Establishing transportation networks, power grids, hospitals, and schools, with each decision affecting many other variables. A rising crime rate leads to a declining population, which erodes the tax base, and so on. But as innovative, informed, and eager to work as Will was, the contact he had to develop the project was redefined. And those guys weren't as excited as he was. They felt they couldn't sell a game where there was no winning. And you know what? If I had to deal with that rejection, I would need months of therapy to recover. But our boy Will simply persevered, and one night during a casual pizza party, he pitched the game's idea to Jeff Brown, a young businessman who was looking to get into video games. And he was honest about it. He told Jeff that nobody liked the project because you can't win in it. But Jeff was like, screw those bozos. I bet there are many megalomaniacs who want to control the world out there. They'll love this. And believe it or not, this is how Maxis was born, to then publish the soon-to-become bestseller video game SimCity in 1989. I have to say, this theme of innovation being pushed back and finding success only on the next attempt is really a constant in this story, and personally, I find it admirable. It takes some courage to keep believing in your own project, even when the world on the outside doesn't really see the point. So, with SimCity coming out in 1989, it's safe to say that in 1991, Will was enjoying some well-deserved family time. From what I gathered, he was committed to being as present as possible in raising his daughter Cassidy, who was born in 1986, and the time he spent playing with her is arguably one of the foundations for the development and release of The Sims. While he was at home with his daughter, Will began to explore the idea for a new game, a kind of interactive dollhouse that adults would like as much as children. When Will was a child, he never got to play with dolls, but when presented with the dollhouse playstyle, as he observed his own daughter, he realized that it was more of a social thing than playing with trains, for example, because it was about the people in the house. With all these ideas in mind, he started looking at his own house in a very different way, and more specifically at the things he owned. He observed all his objects and wondered about the reasons, motives, or needs to have all those things. He kept thinking that there should be a reason for each object and reflected on what that reason was.
"911, what's your emergency?" Flames erupt in the hills of Oakland, claiming property, and now tonight, at least 10 lives and the biggest urban fire in California history still burns out of control.
One morning of that infamous 1991, as Will awoke in his house in the Oakland Hills, he thought he smelled smoke and called 911. He evacuated the property with his family and gathered just a few things to take with them. When they returned 3 days later, the Oakland Hills firestorm had destroyed everything. Nothing was left except some lumps of melted metal, the remains of their other car. But in the months that followed, as the family went about replacing their belongings, Will started thinking again about all the things people needed. He also re-examined the connection between the ownership of goods and happiness. When faced with the wildfire's aftermath, his lost belongings didn't seem to matter as much as the well-being of those around him. But those thoughts would have to simmer in there a little longer, honey, because one thing did survive the fire, and that was Sim Ant's code and conceptual notebooks, which kept Will's project from being permanently lost. He understandably read this as a miracle sign, considering Sim Ant was set to be released by the end of 1991. And this is important for our timeline because Will and the Maxis team decided to program Sim Ant as close to real ants as they could, which means that in-game ants were actually responding to pheromone trails. They were able to get very complex behavior out of the ants just using the pheromone distributions. So, as one would expect from Will Wright, he started to wonder how much of human behavior he could simulate in the same way.
I go around explaining this to people and they stare at me with a blank stare. You know, because I'm seeing these things in my head, these elaborate three-dimensional displays. And these, I kind of know what the simulation would be and the kind of expected emergent behavior coming out of the system. I just cannot convey that to somebody.
So, babe, by now we've understood that this man will turn to books in order to find answers to his questions. And that's exactly what he did this time around as well. 3 books helped Will Wright understand how he could turn these life experiences into a game. One book was called A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander. The book identifies 253 timeless ways of building, which are classified as patterns: stair seats, children's realm, etc. The idea is that the value of architecture can be measured by the happiness of the people who live in it. The second book was the psychologist Abraham Maslow's 1943 paper called A Theory of Human Motivation, in which Maslow described a pyramid-shaped hierarchy of human needs with psychological at the bottom, and above it, safety, love, esteem, and at the top, self-actualization. The third inspiration was Charles Hampton Turner's Map of the Mind, which compares more than 50 theories about how the mind works. By putting these works together, Will found himself the tools to start really imagining a rendering of a simulation of human life, a virtual dollhouse. He didn't agree with everything he had read during his research on human behavior and architecture, yet he used that information to work on how environmental design influenced behavior. He started thinking it would be cool to do a game about architecture where, depending on how well you design something, you'll see people score it by how efficiently they live in it. So, in 1993, Will collected these ideas under one name: Home Tactics, Tactical Domestic Simulator. In this very first prototype, players could build walls, move little guys around, manipulate terrain, and use one toilet. That was the only object interaction he had inserted, since the toilet was an object that could have different interactions with it. It could be cleaned, unclogged, but also used. I think it's fair to say that Home Tactics didn't really reflect the scale of the entire idea Will had in mind, but we're talking about a very early stage of the development before a team was even assembled to start working on it. However, honey, the cold reception it received within Maxis had more to do with the concept behind Home Tactics. People at Maxis didn't think the game made any sense. They could kind of see why, in a game like SimCity, someone would want to build a city and have grandiose towers in it, but they couldn't understand why players would enjoy cleaning the toilet or answering the front door. And they weren't the only ones. Maxis hosted a focus group in 1993 and presented 4 ideas for future games. Apparently, Home Tactics tested very badly. No one liked it at all, and it ranked as the worst idea out of the 4 presented that night. This negative reception obliged Will to put the dollhouse on pause and set it aside for the next 3 years, while he focused on developing the new SimCity chapter, SimCity 2000. Oh, but do not worry, babe. Home Tactics is making a comeback, and a big one. She appeared again in 1996 as a surprise guest at Stanford University. Diva move or what? In April 96, Will Wright gave an insightful talk on interfacing to microworlds for a user interface at Stanford. The original direction of the talk was to have a conversation with the audience about the strengths and weaknesses in the sense of the user-friendliness, replay factor, and creative boundaries in previous efforts by Will's team at Maxis, most precisely SimCity 2000, SimEnt, and SimEarth. During the Q&A section at the end of the talk, one audience member asked what projects or models Will had considered before that were kind of interesting but hadn't developed yet. And Will probably felt he had to show them the work he had considered a hobby for the past 3 years. He showed the audience what appeared to be a slightly modified copy of SimCity 2000, this time allowing the player to see what was happening inside the building's walls and who lived there. He described it as a CAD program that a 10-year-old could use, as the public stared out of fascination and laughed at the vision of a Will-like rag doll perpetually sitting on a toilet.
The behavior is entirely distributed in the environment. So a person's in a room, they have certain motivations, needs, they might be hungry, sleepy, lonely, angry. They scan the room for people and objects, and the objects are all kind of advertising, you know, if you're angry, pick up me and throw me. If you're hungry, eat me, you know. And there's the communication there is all data driven, and even the animation. So the animation of these people is done through this kind of component driven geometry. So they don't have to know how to ride a bike or sit on the toilet. The object tells them how to when they come up and say, okay, you know, you're gonna make me less hungry, I'm gonna interact with you, what do I do? The object tells it what to do. The cool thing about this is that we could drop new objects in later. You know, maybe it's network-based or maybe it's something else. We can even have tools where the users build these objects. Maybe one person is totally into designing furniture or designing exercise equipment. I don't know what, exercise videos. But if we had a tool to where the user could build these things, they could then post them on the net and other people could download them. And then the environment gets more rich.
Among the attendees of the conference, one was Don Hopkins, a user interface aficionado who surprisingly enough would be hired by Maxis that same year to work on Will Wright's team, the team who was working on Project X. Project X was the earliest version of The Sims codebase as we know it. There was no simulation, only architecture. Even as a secret side project, Will managed to snatch the ambitious Jamie Dornbos, a god game enthusiast who had just graduated from Stanford, to ensure the vision for Project X would be manifested with the highest precision. At this time, Wright and Dornbos were considering whether to continue to develop Project X as a zoomed-in SimCity sequel or to split it off into its own franchise. Dornbos advised Will that he didn't want to work on a sequel, and eventually, as we all know, the latter was chosen. The first effort in the development of Project X was the doll maker. Will was the original creator of the technology, where small component sprites were assembled by flipping and offsetting to create an animated person. Dornbos took this technology to make it into a general system that could be used to produce different sizes and shapes of people. Similar to the doll maker, Project X included the creation of tools to make objects, graphic pipelines, tree scripts, basically the development of the game's engine, with special attention to the very smart decision of turning objects into a key element. As we've already mentioned, by focusing on those questions Will had been asking himself while walking around his house, the team identified how objects could effectively satisfy the needs, naturally drawing the subject to them rather than having it the other way around, where the subjects are the main agent of the action and the object simply represents a functioning complement to the subject. This idea also sits very well with the satire of capitalism that the game was intended to be from the very beginning. Sure, Project X renderings make it look like a very distant version compared to the final product, but the work done in the backscene truly established the foundations for the next steps, gaining trust and faith within the Maxis core technology group. And so, Will realized that he wanted to staff Project X as a proper initiative and basically turn the core tech team at Maxis into the core Sims team, that by now had not yet been named Sims Team, but also wasn't named Project X Team anymore, because the team was now working on the Jefferson project. We have now reached the year 1997. Back then, I personally was only 3 years old, and silly me, instead of purchasing property, I was, without even knowing it, waiting for Will Wright to release a video game that would change my life forever. I mean, can you imagine if he never thought about making The Sims? What would I've played obsessively while my parents were divorcing? TMI? Sorry, but you know I'm always spilling some tea, honey, even if it's my own. Anyway, I need us to focus on 1997 because this year is the one that represents many changes in the development of The Sims. As we said, Project X was ready to evolve into a bigger project, one that required a bigger team. At the same time, the turmoil at Maxis was becoming more and more significant. Why? Well, the company was not navigating the happiest of waters, and talks of a possible merger with a big industry shark were circulating at Maxis headquarters. But between rumors and uncertainty, Will Wright's newly assembled team kept moving forward with the Jefferson project. To give you an idea of the vibes, but also highlight how we were getting closer to the original The Sims style, I'll read you the game description from the Jefferson design document drafted in July 97. Jefferson is a family simulator in which you are in charge of the creation, maintenance, and happiness of 1 to 6 people in your own specially designed household. You can live vicariously through a dream family in your dream house or simulate your own family in a model of your own house and see what excitement your fantasy life holds in store. As you play, you'll balance quality of life against material possessions, work against play, and discover the subtle interplay that makes your family an organic unit. You'll also find that success comes with its own challenges. A big house and a busy life can be gratifying, but if you don't find your own ways to deal with the increasing chaos of everyday life, you'll find your success short-lived. How you manage your family determines how successful you're going to be. You can create a family of rich yuppies, scholarly artists, or a party band. Each requires a different approach to making money, friends, and living well. I just love this. And also, by reading this intro from the design document, it's so clear that the vision Will Wright had was now really becoming a structured concept. If you think about it, had you encountered this game description in a quiz, you would immediately understand we were talking about The Sims. In fact, it's not a coincidence that this is the stage that saw the formation of what would become the game's core team. It included the original SimCity artists Jenny Martin and Susan Green, who worked on what would become the very first Sim to be created for the game. At this point in the development, characters with distinct features were created, even if the concept of full customizable heads and bodies was still distant. The project's name was a fun nod to former US President and Constitution co-writer Thomas Jefferson's words of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, in a way mirroring the philosophy of this new game. The vibes of the Jefferson project were also taking inspiration from television, more specifically sitcoms. The team started experimenting with things like laugh tracks to help emphasize in-game events, but also exploring how the storytelling could be placed in the gameplay, probably still figuring out how big of a part this would play in the final result. I know the stage of the development tends to get overlooked when we think about the Sims games, but honestly, the Jefferson project allowed the team to take gigantic steps forward and really drive the concept closer to the final vision. At this time, the user interface received a huge overhaul. Gone were the SimCity 2000 inspired roots and MS Paint style item selection. Such elements were scrapped in favor of a much more original design that seamlessly integrated with the game's upgraded graphics and pre-rendered 3D aesthetics. This new interface featured 3 core modes: people, furniture, and architecture, organizing purchasable items into easily navigable categories. A classic analog clock placed at the part of the UI that deliberately resembled a house roof occupied the uppermost corner of the control panel, also providing players with accessible information about the current household's funds and day of the month. Because in the Jefferson era, the calendar was a very predominant feature of the gameplay, as the team wanted a calendar that mirrored the real world as much as possible. This calendar from the Jefferson time still exists in the final game, and it even keeps track, although hidden from the player, at all times. And of course, my favorite part of this era is the creation of the very first Sims named Edith, Archie, Samantha, and Darren. I know, clunky faces, but obviously full of personality. And one of the characters, actually the first of the series to be conceptualized, Edith, she became so popular with the team that they renamed their editing suite after her. In this phase, gameplay was biased towards close-ended scenarios for demo purposes, and the scenes developed during the Jefferson times basically resembled a lot the in-game tutorials that by now we all know. Because God Sims video games, let alone domestic God Sims, were relatively new in the industry, and ultimately the tutorials would prove useful to the final game's player base. The first scenario, called Tutorial Home 1 Motives, starred our girl Edith challenging the player to manage her needs in order to keep her happy and alive. Yes, at this stage we encountered the earliest record of concepts for needs as we know them today. They were segmented into two types, physical and mental, and even included alertness and stress, which didn't make their way to the game's retail build, if not as remnants in code and graphics, likely because they redundantly antagonize the energy and fun motives and, well, make the whole experience unnecessarily stressful. The final tutorial home was called Grand Play, and babe, you need to listen to the description they inserted for it in the Jefferson design document. We lied! There is no Tutorial 6 setup. Feel free to horse around in our test home labeled Lovely Home Pre-Furnished. You'll need to manually spawn some people from the toolbar. Advanced users, spawn a Samantha and see if you can get her to take a shower for you. Enjoy our clever transparency tricks. Oh my god. Be very careful of the Big Brother object. Its low price may deceive you, it can be very benevolent, but it's a very dangerous object. Beware! I am really curious about this Big Brother object thing, but couldn't really find any additional explanation. I'm thinking maybe a TV? As a pun on the TV sets depicted in the novel 1984? I don't know, that's just the first thing that came up in my mind, but I guess we'll never know. There are two other things that I found very interesting about this phase, and as I didn't really know where to fit them, I'll just add them here. The first one is that Sims required players to open doors for them rather than doing it automatically. Remnants of this are left in unused animations, but are never invoked in the final game. Another cool thing is that Jefferson had an interaction where Sims could show visitors around their house. This feature was also removed, as in the final game, visitors simply know the layout of a house. But as hard as it is to believe, in this era of innovation and exciting new things coming out of the Jefferson project, things at Maxis weren't looking so bright. It became apparent that in order to salvage their sinking reputation and profits, Maxis would need to be bought out by a larger company. At this time, Will Wright knew that part of the decision meant laying off about 40% of his roughly 240 Maxis employees. But he was also aware that without the acquisition, all employees would have ended up jobless. It was just a matter of time. There were talks with Infogrames and Activision, though ultimately Electronic Arts bought Maxis for $125 million. From day one, EA appointed a 35-year-old French engineer named Luc Bartlett to become the general manager of Maxis. In reflecting on the acquisition, Bartlett felt as though the problem was that Maxis management was not focused on product development, but rather trying to make Maxis into everything EA was, without having the focus or infrastructure to do that. Bartlett would move into the Maxis office full-time in the summer of '97 and be greeted by a studio filled with strife, anger, and disillusionment. There were a lot of staffing changes, and the company culture was undergoing a dramatic transformation. While Will Wright wanted to make sure The Sims in its embryonic state was protected from the craziness that was going on, there remained considerable skepticism among sales and marketing people. The executives felt that The Sims had potential, but didn't think it was a guaranteed hit. Who would buy a game without clear objectives about going to the bathroom and doing housework? Some of the EA old guard didn't trust Will's vision, didn't get the idea of the dollhouse, didn't think it would sell, and wanted to gut out the most interesting part of the game, like the architecture tools, but Will had to stick to his guns. Luke Bartlett played a key role in this phase as he supported the Dollhouse project, and over the next few months, EA would search the world for the best talent to bring to work specifically on this project. For Will, this newfound comfort and isolation from financial pressure were a welcome change. And although his enthusiasm was echoed within his team, there was still a long way to go for everyone at EA to start believing in the Dollhouse. What was the state of the Dollhouse project in early '98, right after the EA acquisition? Just like the previous known build, the game was still based on scripted scenarios featuring a very limited amount of pre-made characters. Most likely, players couldn't yet create families from scratch. The new protagonists of the pre-scripted scenarios were Sigmund Silver, Gail Yale, Brad, Dune Ha, Fritz Frisbee, the Colonel, the Duchess, sometimes internally named Josephine Solo, and Crazy Larry. We don't have much information about their adventures in the tutorial homes, but we can tell just by looking at them that Gail Yale and Brad will actually make it to the very end with different names. And curiously enough, Sigmund Silver and the Duchess will become the faces of a system bug in the final version of The Sims. Whenever the thumbnails are absent or corrupted, you'll see them replaced with either Sigmund or the Duchess pictured upside down. Though still notably cartoonish compared to the final Sims, the characters now had a higher polygon count than the previous ones, reflecting the team's attempt to keep pace with the contemporary graphical processing. A definitive step in the graphic overhaul was the relocation of the control panel. It was no longer a vertical rectangular bar positioned on the leftmost side of the screen. Instead, it had been transformed into a horizontal bar situated at the bottom of the screen, a placement choice that would persist throughout development and, as we know, into the final version of the game. This early '98 phase also saw the official introduction of the Interactions Pie menu. Obviously, a rudimentary and bulky version of it compared to the one we all know and love, but I still think it's interesting to see such an iconic gameplay element in its very first look. With the big acquisition still settling in for everyone who remained on the Maxis ship, plus the adoption of a new way of working and a new culture at Electronic Arts, Will Wright and his team had a lot to deal with. But this didn't stop the innovation. Because with new talent and new resources at their disposal, The Sims was starting to look like The Sims, and with the implementation of fabulous new animations, the vision was really taking off. In June 1998, the developers promptly compiled a new demo for the no longer nameless game, now called The Sims, showcasing resources still in development. It's not hard to imagine why they had to. Obviously, now under the corporate umbrella of EA, they had to present their work to convince the still skeptical committees of the company in order to secure the green light for the game's concept and continue production on a more stable foundation. The demo introduced a remade scenario-based storyline centered around a male character named Ross, a man in the pursuit of good fortune who lives in a brand new neighborhood named Happy Acres. Although there was no create a character tool just yet, we can already see the neighborhood view coming together, resembling a typical simulation game campaign menu. As with the previous demo builds, the game adopts a pre-scripted scenario format for each available house file. Just like the Jefferson version, these scenarios felt like tutorials, but for this specific demo, they were really there to show more of the capabilities of the game. The first scenario was about Ross having suffered an accident that caused him amnesia, asking the player to help him with his basic needs, as he had clearly forgotten. The second scenario was about two girls who needed to balance their household expenses, highlighting the tycoon money manager style of the gameplay. The third scenario was about Ross trying to woo one of the two broke girls, showcasing the social interactions aspect of the game. And the fourth and final scenario was all about build and buy mode, giving the player a nice budget to simply go crazy and decorate a home for two brothers. The aesthetic of this new version of The Sims looked cleaner and more organized, even dropping the dark color scheme we saw in previous renderings for the UI for a calmer beige tone. The interaction pie menus style was significantly simplified, resembling the design we know today. The three-dimensional background was replaced with a sphere featuring a progressive contour and a blending effect that decreased the saturation and brightness of the in-game world screen rendered directly underneath it. Additionally, the head of the active character now appeared across the sphere, always facing the mouse. This demo for The Sims was good enough to convince EA to fund and support the project and to bring it to the finish line. And with that green light over their head, the team proceeded with some major facelift for the infamous Dollhouse game. Eric Erk Hedman. Remember that name, babe, because he is the reason The Sims started looking like The Sims. As the lead animator, his gorgeous mock-ups show us the moment the game started finding its visual identity. And the attention to detail, unreal. Even back then, they were experimenting with diagonal doors and windows in the isometric grid, which was very ahead of their time. You can even spot foundations under the houses, something that wouldn't actually make it into the series until The Sims 2. Some objects for these early mock-ups made it to the final game basically untouched, like the dresser and the dining table. And animation-wise, Hedman was handcrafting keyframes like his life depended on it, ready to be powered by Don Hopkins' animation engine. These weren't just pretty frames, they were efficient for the tile-based world of The Sims. Plus, new behavior animations were already being created, making Sims feel more alive than ever. But the visuals weren't the only thing leveling up. Gameplay was also having a glow up. By December 98, the now iconic mantra "Build, Buy, Live" had officially made its way into the UI. But there was also an interesting addition that didn't survive the final cut: the brain panel. This idea came from Eric Bobo Bowman, the project's graphic engineer. Basically, it was a little brain icon between the family portrait and the needs panel. Each section of the brain corresponded to different sub-panels: motives, personality, skills, and relationship. Once you clicked on one of the brain lobes, voila! Stats for that category appeared. By the end of 1998, development was moving faster than a married man in Ariana Grande's DMs, honey. Suddenly, the Dollhouse project wasn't just some quirky experiment. It was starting to feel like a proper, real game. And then, a little surprise for SimCity fans. A teaser for The Sims was slipped into SimCity 3000's demo files. In the demo, 3 pre-made Sims, Sam, Ross, and Mercedes, waved at the player from a residential lot under construction, teasing a new game, a new focus, a new way of life. Little did they know, they wouldn't stay Sam, Ross, and Mercedes for long. They would soon be whoever players wanted them to be. Okay, so if The Sims came out in early 2000, when did the plumb bob actually show up? Well, get ready for this. The first head icon above a sim wasn't even a plumb bob. It was a spinning arrow added in January 99. And it was pretty useless. It didn't change color, didn't reflect the mood, it was just spinning. By March, that arrow got swapped for a green polygon shaped like a flipped house. And this one finally reacted to Sims' needs, changing from green to red depending on their mood. By May, the shape evolved into the octagonal green diva we know today. And just like that, the plumb bob, now one of the most recognizable icons in gaming, was born. Isn't it wild that the symbol of the entire franchise was one of the last things that were added? And the same goes for the Goth family. Yes, the family. Mortimer and Cassandra were only added in late 99, with Bella being the final family member squeezed in just months before launch. And if you're wondering about children, well, those almost didn't make it in either. Will Wright had a whole debate over whether children should be in the game at all, but they finally appeared in around February 99. Fun fact, the animations weren't quite ready yet, which led to some hilarious height glitches when kids tried to use adult objects like kitchen counters. Meanwhile, the game's neighborhood screen was also evolving. Early prototypes showed sprawling street networks, but by March 99, the team had landed on the now iconic single road loop with a river, Sim Lane as we know it. They even added pine and apple trees for some extra charm. By now, the visuals were really coming together. The logo, though, honey, that was still a work in progress. It wouldn't settle into its final form until July 99. An honorable mention goes to the Brain panel. Rest in peace, you Sims legend. Now retired by the developers for good, with small icons replacing the buttons in the panel, likely seeking clearer visual communication. To complete the implementation of these first 4 months of 99, the team came up with a new scenario to showcase the game called the Bachelor Pad. The skin of Ross from the previous demos of the game came back as Michael Ryan, a single, presumably sloppy sim who progresses through life, turning his pad into a family home once he gets married and has children. His story, upgrading his sloppy life into a family home, even became the centerpiece at E3 99. And oh boy, if you've seen my E3 deep dive, you know this. EA hid The Sims in a sad little booth, but the game stole the show when two random female Sims attending Michael's wedding decided to passionately kiss. Talk about making headlines. And speaking of headlines, the marketing had already started ramping up. EA sent out press kit CDs to magazines and even hacked the SimCity website with the cheeky "Free the Sims" message to make it look like the Sims protested against the lack of recognition they received for their active role in the SimCity series. A few days after the event, it was revealed on the SimCity website that this was just a joke, but for the purpose of announcing the development of The Sims to the fans. All of this served as a basic introduction to the game's premise, offering audiences a sneak peek through pre-rendered images, mocked-up gameplay snapshots, and Will Wright interview snippets. These were interestingly widely circulated across gaming websites at the time, to the point that even today, many sources utilize them when covering the original The Sims game.
It's a game about people. Not real people, but simulated people. The Sims. Phew.
Isn't Isn't it funny that up until July 99, there were no previews of Create a Character in the press kits? Yeah, even though it's such a core part of the Sims franchise now, it wasn't shown off until after the E3 demo. By July, it already looked close to the final version, but it wasn't until October 99 that it finally got the name Create a Sim, plus little tweaks like replacing the old pulsating bar with the now familiar Enter First Name line. The team was still having a lot of discussions about how story-based the game should have been, but it was pretty clear when they sat and played the game that the player was telling a story, and this is probably one of the reasons why they decided to give so much importance to customization. Luke Bartlett took a very strong interest in building a community around the game in order to put heavy emphasis on the customization, even if that would have meant spending a little more time to release The Sims. If the game was a success, then that extra time would be well worth it because of the community they could build around it. In hindsight, very smart, huh? But let's not get too excited here, because while Bartlett really believed in Will's vision and the potential of the game, EA higher-ups were kind of ready to see it flop. There were still a lot of questions about what the game actually was. Many of the executives didn't really believe in the product, thinking it wouldn't be a bestseller. As one said, it will sell maybe 250k units and be out of Will's hair. Say what now? Businessmen not understanding the impact and value of innovation while still trying to crunch numbers around it? A groundbreaking, right? Nevertheless, those who did trust the potential of The Sims were engaging more and more with the community. 8 months before the release of the game, they started with a mailing list for the very hardcore SimCity webmasters and told them that they were going to get their involvement very early on and start building the first Sims websites. 2 months before the game's release, they set up some webcam events, basically a chat room with a live webcam of the developers playing the game. Fans in the chat room could share their input and ideas on what to do next in the gameplay to see the story unfold from the developers' computers. According to Will Wright, this type of event gave future players a really good sense for how open-ended the game was. They were showing that just about anything you could imagine, you could do it in the game. But between marketing campaigns and chats with the fans, there was still a lot of stuff being finalized behind the scenes. A new logo and cover mock-ups were created for the press and Prima's official guide. The UI got a facelift. By July 99, the character thumbnails and palette matched the final game, and the mode buttons gained better contrast. October 1999 marked alpha production, meaning all core features and objects were done. But now the team was finalizing households. This is when the gods and the newbies appeared, though the newbies weren't yet the tutorial family we know today. One thing that I found very interesting is the release of SimTalk 1.0, a very simple program developed by assistant producer Sean Beatty and released on October the 13th, 1999. This program let fans hear Simlish for the very first time via audio files. Some of those recordings never even made it into the final game, but for pre-release fans, it was a taste of something totally new.
Claire,
Now, with everything getting its final tweaks and last-minute changes, there was one last question to answer. What to do with the infamous bachelor, Michael Ryan? After all, he had represented the gameplay to press and investors for a while now, with his story progression from lazy bum to diligent father. And maybe his presence in a lot of the earlier promotional material is what had the team decide to put him in the game's tutorial, set to begin when the player launched the game. In fact, in outdated versions of the game's manual, we see Michael as the star of the tutorial. But as we all know, that was his last real appearance in the game, since the tutorial task was assigned to Bob and Betty Newby, and the title of the neighborhood's bachelor was given to a Mr. Bachelor, who proudly carried out the legacy with his name, Michael. Let's talk about last-minute changes. The original object thumbnail template was recolored a few days before the final build's compilation, shifting from a scale of white to a scale of light blue. In Create a Sim, the character viewer's camera now alternated the model's facing direction between southwest and southeast, and the group meal dishes were changed from oval to circular. I know, groundbreaking changes, but hey, being the very last ones, I feel they needed to be mentioned. Since we're approaching the release time for The Sims and we've been mentioning the several implementations of the game, I think it's needed to sprinkle the scene with the underlying tension that the team was still facing with EA. During an interview with Vice, the game art director Charles London said, "The biggest challenge was getting key stakeholders at EA to understand what it was we were making and why we should be making it. Generally, the opinion was that successful games were about escapism, they were about being somebody else or having powers nobody ever had. This game was the exact opposite of that." One of the game's producers, Connor Ryan, added, "They were the enemy. I hate to say it that way, but there was so much scrutiny. We'd have these exact meetings, and it was always like we were just fighting for another day." But to sum up the sentiment in my favorite quote from this article, let me read you what Jerry Martin, composer of the game's soundtrack, said. At one point, some of the executives didn't even want to put the game out. But then, when they did and it started making tons of money, a lot more people came over from EA and pretended they were involved with it. It was a bunch of bullshit.
It features no explosions, there is little gore.
The Sims. It's a new game every day.
Best-selling computer game sold over 3 million copies at $40 a pop. But it does give players one little corner of the world they can control.
In February 2000, The Sims came out with little advance word or buzz. When asked about it, Will Wright remembered the very first review they got, which was quite negative. It wasn't a website where somebody wrote a pretty scathing review of the game. It was depressing reading it, and Will recalled feeling rattled, thinking, "Oh my god, they didn't get it. I hope somebody else gets it." But you know the story. In fact, many people got it. And once every other review came out, the game was deemed a total success. Within 1 year, The Sims became Will Wright's biggest hit.
I just cannot convey that to somebody.
Knowing the twists and turns this story had to take to achieve major success, I think it's understandable how surprised everyone involved was, even the people who always believed in the potential of The Sims. Will Wright himself admitted he never thought The Sims would surpass the success of SimCity, and of course, I have to read you, once again, the words of music composer Jerry Martin about the incredible sales of the game. He said, I remember going to one of our company meetings where they were talking about the money that was being made. I just went, holy shit, you've got to be kidding me. I couldn't believe it. I know, he's a legend. The actors who voiced The Sims were even told that there was no time during the day or night, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, that their voices were not being heard somewhere in the world. I mean, I can't even imagine how this made them feel and how much it validated and rewarded their work on the project. But you know, honey, if there was one group of extremely surprised people, it had to be all the higher-ups at EA's headquarters. One thing especially shocked them, and that was the high success The Sims seemed to have with the female audience. One slice of the cake that probably barely existed in EA's graphs and plans was now the one injecting so much interest and money into their product. As much as they didn't foresee how many people would have played the game, they also didn't consider who would be playing the game. Game designer Roxy Volosenko told Vice, "We never set out to make this a game that was popular with girls at all. We were just making a game that was interesting to us. Girls just ended up finding it. It had all this interesting depth that wasn't present in a lot of other games." Will Wright himself also reflected on this when a smart-ass journalist from Rock Paper Shotgun asked him about it, implying girls liked The Sims because it was a virtual dollhouse and girls liked playing dolls. Wright replied, "I don't think the reason women bought it was because they wanted to play with dolls. I think, if anything, real women have a higher standard of leisure entertainment than men do. They tend to go for entertainment that is a little more expressive. Also, entertainment that connects back to them and has some personal meaning. The Sims allows a path where you can play it as a deep, personal reflection of yourself. Also, at the same time, there weren't any games available besides sports and fantasy and whatever. Games are remarkably narrow. For how elaborate the medium is and how many copies we sell, it's amazing how few subjects we deal with." After being released, The Sims' success continued with millions of copies being sold worldwide, reaching the 16 million milestone by February 2005. It marked a pivotal moment for the video game industry and opened the door to years of success for everyone involved in the project, especially the creator, Will Wright. From an observation of modern life to a real simulation of human behavior, the game successfully put together entertainment, creativity, storytelling, humor, and technology, quickly becoming a cultural phenomenon, a recognizable brand, a means to bring people together. While researching for this video, I found a quote from someone who said it's really cool that everyone by now has a Sims story, like a recollection of the time they spent playing the game. And I agree. My story is the one of a child who was feeling a bit lost and at the same time very responsible for things that were not in my control. When I spotted this game and understood what it was about, I couldn't believe it. It was unthinkable to me that someone was capable of creating such a liberating game, an experience for me to be successfully in control but also escape into the lives of simulated people, while my own fantasy could be completely free to come up with all kinds of stories. It was life-changing. And learning about the turbulent and complicated path the creatives behind it had to take in order to bring this project out of Will Wright's mind and into the homes of millions of people has been insightful and honestly a life lesson, at least for me. The Sims was created despite the amount of rejection it received, fueled by the resilience and the commitment of those who believed there was someone out there who was simply going to get it. That gut feeling we all have about the things we care about, well, this story taught me how important it is to learn how to trust it. My drama friends, what a freaking journey through time we took today. A special shout out goes to the Cutting Room Floor website that provided me with so much of the information you saw in this video, and I highly recommend checking it out if you want to dive deeper into the history of The Sims. I'm gonna add all the resources used for the video in a document linked in the description, so feel free to consult it. If you've made it to the end of this video, don't forget to comment on the terrace smoking with Will, so I can personally thank you because you are the real MVP. This was a video I've wanted to make for a long time, and I'm so happy I got to finally do it, and I truly hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please don't be shy. Leave a like and join me here at the Drama House for more deep dives, gameplay videos, and lore discoveries. We talk all about the past, present, and future of life simulation video games, so come on in, the door is open. Thank you so much for stopping by today. You are home, baby. My name is Lady Drama, and I hope I'll see you very soon.